Hello?
Hey.
Okay, the participants who are admitted and in now, those some of the public as well who are hearing this conversation or what? I'm seeing 39 participants. Hello? Hi. Oh, hello, Angelina. Hi, Eugene. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome each of you to this afternoon's virtual talk. You are coming to us from many different countries, many different states. Over 400 of you have registered to be with us this afternoon. We are grateful for that. So we acknowledge that we are coming to you from Salt Lake City. We are standing in the unceded ancestral lands of the Goshu, Ute, Eastern Shoshone, and Paiute people. We are headquartered, we are using Zoom technology, which is headquartered in San Jose, California, on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. We also must acknowledge that the prosperity of what we call these United States was dependent on the labor of enslaved people. So beyond the new acknowledgements that we are using here at the University of Utah, I invite you to act, so either through education, participation, learning more, and donations to support those organizations, entities, and communities. I am Erika George. I'm the director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm also the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. The Tanner Humanities Center is named for Obert and Grace Tanner. The Tanner Humanities Center serves to promote humanities inquiry and exchange through education, outreach, and public programming. Launched in 2020, February 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago, was this series, the Tanner Talk series. It was my effort to give us an opportunity to have unscripted conversations about contemporary challenging issues that are changing our world through a humanities perspective. So our first speaker for the series had been Professor Ibram Kendi, who's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I highly recommend. And we are joined today by our second Tanner speaker. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors. They are the ones who made today possible. Our diamond sponsor is OC Tanner Foundation. The Tanner Doubt Foundation for years has been our longtime supporter. They enable us to advance this mission. They ensure that we are able to increase our visibility and remain viable, and to reach new lifelong learners and loyal audiences, students, faculty, and staff alike. So we are deeply grateful to them and we thank them. Our additional sponsors represent a diverse group of campus and community organizations committed to our focus on technology and the humanities for this year. We will be turning these questions to conversations about race, technology, and justice. Our Emerald sponsors are the College of Humanities, led by Dean Stuart Culver, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office, led by Marianne Villarreal. We've also received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and Utah Humanities, led by Jody Graham. Our Ruby sponsors include our students, the Associated Students of the University of Utah, with the president, Ephraim Kuhn, who've been very generous to us. The organization Code and Color, founded by Karen Rodriguez La Paz. The School for Cultural and Social Transformation, led by Dean Catherine Stockton. The Office of the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, led by Dan Reed. And we also are joined by X Mission, founded by Pete Ashdown. Our Sapphire in-kind sponsors include our colleagues at the Digital Matters program, the King's English Bookstore, who have supplied Ruha's book to those of you who won our online contests and our students, and also the David Eccles School of Business, who generously facilitated the Zoom webinar for us. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my support staff who support me daily and have made this possible. That includes Beth James, our Associate Director, Susan Anderson, our Development Officer, and Katie Puglia, who is our Marketing and Communications Coordinator. We will also be joined by students and postdoctoral fellows who will be facilitating the Q&A following the conversation that we will have with our speaker, who I will announce after explaining this series. So Tanner Talks this year will be talking about technology. We're taking technology and the humanities as our theme so that the center can center the examination of social and cultural impacts of technology and innovation on humanity. Today, we're going to explore algorithmic justice and approaches for a more inclusive technological innovation informed by human experience. And we will have this conversation with Professor Ruha Benjamin, who I'm excited to welcome. Professor Benjamin is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and she is the founder of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. Her work analyzes the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine. Her books include Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, Captivating Technology, an edited volume, Race, Carceral Technoscience, and the Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life. And then her first book, The People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier. She writes, teaches, and speaks widely about the relationship between knowledge and power, and race and citizenship, health and justice. Her next book project, tentatively titled The Emperor's New Genes, Borders, Belongings, and Bioethics Beyond the Genome, which I cannot wait to read, is going to investigate how human population genetics reinforce and reflect and sometimes challenge the socio-political distinctions such as race and class that many communities confront. So taken together, her body of work addresses debates about how science and technology shape our social world and how people can and should and engage in the technoscience balancing risks and rewards of progress. And she offers provocations around the notion of progress. So please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Professor George. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with all of you today. And anytime there's such a long list of co-sponsors, I can't wait, because it means it's really cutting across our usual silos in academia and bringing together people in interesting conversations. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Wonderful. We're thrilled to have you. So a bit about our Tanner Talk structure for the audience. The way the format works is I will ask or invite Professor Benjamin to comment on a series of topics that I've drawn from her body of work. We will then turn the program over to our colleague who will work our Q&A. So I'd like to invite you to use, you'll see on your Zoom webinar screen, a chat function, happy to chat, but please make an effort to put your questions in the Q&A box. They will then be forwarded to us, and Professor Benjamin will be able to address them. So we'll combine and connect as much as we can and acknowledge those of you who have questions in this format. I did see a few of the questions that came in before this talk, and many of them beyond race and technology were simply interested in race and racism. And I was struck by the name of the lab that you founded, the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. And I think Ida B. Wells, as a person, as an activist, as a woman, would be an interesting way for us to begin to talk broadly about the connection between what you're writing in the new Jim Code and the good old Jim Crow. This is another book I'll recommend. I'm plugging books today. A law professor, former law professor, Michelle Alexander, who really tries to capture our present moment, appreciating that we're coming from a past. So in all of this, I suppose the point I'd like you to address, or the question I'm asking you, is to talk to us about notions of race and racism. Why is it that you're expressing your work through the lens of new Jim Code? And how does that relate to Jim Crow?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think part of what both Michelle Alexander's work and mine and many others, including your own, is wrestling with is how to think about what of today is different in terms of our racial relations, in the racism in our institutions, the everyday expression of anti-Blackness, what's distinct, and what is a continuity with the past, what is a different expression, perhaps a different guise or a different form, but which retains the same logics or outcomes. And I think the answer to that is not easy. There's not a nice little 2x2 table that we could make that would put some things in one box and some things in another. It's an ongoing intellectual and I think advocacy concern to think about what is what are the continuities and discontinuities with the past. What I think of as next gen racism is how my students and I talk about it. That is, what of today that they have to grapple with is different from their grandparents, and what's just like old wine in new bottles, as it were. And so for the new Jim Crow, what that concept and that framework really does powerfully is to show how different institutions carry the baton of racial domination, how even though formally slavery ended, it transformed into another institution that maintains certain forms of racial and social control. Then we had Jim Crow, which legally allowed discrimination to persist in all of our institutions. We also had we have and continue to live with the legacy of geographic segregation, and the way that in many ways today our geography of our country, which is as if not more segregated in many cases than it was in a prior era, continues the tradition of racial domination in terms of the allocation of resources, in terms of political power, in terms of opportunity and life chances. And geography in many ways naturalizes racial hierarchies so that we can look at a particular geography, a white neighborhood or a Black neighborhood, and come up with different stories that justifies why some places have abundant resources, whether green space or financial institutions or grocery stores, and some places have been divested from. And so we have to think about that as another sort of stage in the ongoing tradition of racial domination. And of course, Michelle Alexander's work focuses squarely on the role of our incarceration system as allowing for this racial domination to persist. And so what we have to kind of come to grips with the story of progress that we tell ourselves as a nation, that somehow magically the passage of laws in the 60s sort of like fairy dust transformed the world so that we are now living in some completely new post-racial reality. We know that's not true. And so for me, it brings us to the new Jim Code, where although I'm really still interested in the role of incarceration, I'm specifically interested in technologies that promote this kind of racial and social control, the role of technology, because that is what we associate as the height of progress. Whenever we imagine the future, it's filled with new gadgets and new systems that sort of promise that we've overcome these old ways of doing things in the past. So if anything really contains the hope of progress, it's new technologies. And yet these become some of the prime perpetuators of racial domination. And I know it's hard for many people when they're first encountering it to really wrap their heads around it, because we think of technology as asocial and apolitical. It's as if it's in a bubble, or it grows on trees. You know, we don't think about technology as what it is, which is the handiwork of human invention, which includes the biases, assumptions, the desires, the worldviews of the people who create it, the people who use it, the society in which it circulates. And so the new Jim Code is sort of priming us to think more critically about our relationship to technology and what it does in the world, but also it leaves open the idea that we can design things differently. The technologies that we have, it's not inevitable. You know, as much as some inventors would like us to believe that we have no choice in the matter, we just have to live with the inventions, the designs of their handiwork. We have a choice, and we can design differently, and we can resist the technologies that we decide collectively, democratically, we don't like, that don't serve us. And we can pour our energies and our insights and our imagination into creating different tools that actually enhance justice, enhance equity. And so that's what the work of the new Jim Code, offering a prescription, a critique, but also opening a door to say, well, now that we see that, what can we do differently? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, and I do this almost every day and yet
Me
still
too.
mute myself. So thank you very much. And I think that's responsive to a question we received from Myrna Driscoll, who was interested in the past and the future. And it's encouraging to hear that you think we can imagine something different. I want to take you deeper into how the tools of Jim Code operate. So in your book, in chapters Engineered Inequality and Coded Exposure, you highlight examples that speak both to the erasure and exposure that is associated with tech engagement in people of color. I'm looking at your hair, looking at mine. I wonder if perhaps you've had some instances with TSA, for example. Perhaps you could share a few. I was really intrigued by the case study on Polaroid, HP, just for audience members who may not have had similar experiences. Could you take us through how this has come to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can start with a viral video that was really popular a few years ago. Some of you may have seen it, with two friends that were in a hotel bathroom, and they filmed themselves trying to use the soap dispenser. And the soap wouldn't come out on the darker skinned friend. It only came out on the lighter skinned friend. And so they were giggling throughout the clip, and it went viral, but it brought to the light, like if you go and look for it now, people have tagged it racist soap dispenser, right? But it really, although it seems like superficial, it seems inconsequential, like who cares, just, you know, use water or go to another soap dispenser. It actually offers a really compelling window on a much larger phenomenon, which is about how simple and complex tools are designed, who is doing the designing, for whom, and what's that process like. And so with the soap dispenser, we might ask, why wasn't this caught before it was installed? What was missing in the design process that those who are using infrared technology, which we know darker skin absorbs light, that no one caught this glitch before it actually was rolled out into hotels? And so it's not simply about one tool or one instance, it's about questioning the process by which we design anything. And so, you know, we can take that particular recent instant and look back in time, which you're referring to, and look at, you know, analog or old school photographic technologies, which for the longest time had a hard time, again, picking up darker skin, the features of darker skinned people, in part because they used Shirley cards, which were images of white women, to calibrate the lighting and calibrate the technique. And so the technology was honed on the image of Shirley, which was the name of the model in the card, so that if you didn't fit that norm, the Shirley norm, then this technology was not developed in a way that would detect you. And what's interesting is that, how did this come to light? Why was this addressed? How was this addressed when it comes to Polaroid and others? Well, one particular part of the story is that when schools became more integrated and they were taking school pictures and you had Black and white kids in the same photo, the person taking the photo had to decide whose image is it going to focus on. And Black parents were angry when they got the photos and their kids were all blurry in the picture. But at that time, that was not quite enough to get the companies to address it. What really motivated them was that chocolate producers and wood furniture producers were angry that the photos of their products were not coming out very well. And so these two, sectors, chocolate and wood furniture, they were a really strong lobby to get the photographic techniques to develop in a way that was more discerning. And so here we see the role of profit in actually enacting change, in whose interests or concerns are taken seriously. It wasn't the Black parents who were concerned about their kids showing up. It was the chocolate and furniture manufacturers. But what happened in terms of those kind of techniques still continue in other forms today. A colleague of mine, Joy Bulumwini, who at the time was a grad student at MIT, she was doing a project for a class in which she had to use facial recognition system on her computer, the little light over the computer, and it wouldn't pick her up. She's a darker skinned woman. And the only way that the digital lens would pick her up is if she put a white mask on, and then it would detect her face. And so that led her to engage in a really long research and advocacy initiative, which is called Algorithmic Justice League. You can look that up, or someone can post the website in the chat, that has to do with facial recognition. Now, mind you, these are systems that are used in all kinds of places, private and public sector. That means just because they don't work well on a vast majority of the population doesn't mean that people aren't using them. They're using them throughout, our society. Yet it was only when Joy's hit the news that they were confronted with the fact that they were faulty in this way, that they didn't detect darker skin, but specifically that they had a hard time detecting Black women in particular, and misgendering Black women through these systems that are nevertheless used to identify people. And so you can look up Joy's work, but this is just to give you a sense of the trajectory. Like, we go from soap dispensers, which seem it's not that important, to go to the history of photography, come back to the present day context of facial recognition, where these systems can actually have huge impacts on people's lives. There have been people who've been falsely arrested because they've been identified by facial recognition systems that did not detect them properly. And so the consequences of discriminatory design. And the last thing I'll just say on this point is that a technology can be discriminatory without the designers intending it to be. So when I say discriminatory, people say, well, oh, do you think that they really tried to do that? It doesn't matter. If they tried or wanted this to happen, this is the effect, this is the outcome. And so I think that it is accurate to call it discriminatory in its effects, whether or not the individuals behind the screen intended it to be so. We don't need a racist boogeyman sort of coding to harm people. There are those, certainly, and we have examples. You have your own examples right in Utah, in fact, but that's not a requirement for a technology to have discriminatory effects. And I should just emphasize that these are systems that are used throughout our life. Many times we're being judged and we're being tracked without knowing by systems that have been created under the guise of objectivity and neutrality and progress. They're making decisions about whether we can get a home loan or not, whether we can get a particular kind of treatment at the hospital, whether our kids get into a certain school, what's every consequential decisions, whether I qualify for food stamps, whether I am considered a danger to my child and have my child taken away from me in terms of, child welfare. And almost every arena is adopting automated systems and AI tools because they've been promised that this is going to make things more efficient, and in many cases promise that they'll make things more fair. And that those promises rest on a lie, which is that human beings are not the ones shaping those judgments, when in fact they are. And human decisions in the past are being used to train automated systems how to make decisions for the future. So however we've made decisions in the past, let's say in a hospital, let's say Black patients have not been given as much care, and therefore not as much has been spent on their treatment over, let's say, the last 50 years. When we teach an automated system who to allocate resources to, that is digital triaging in the future, that past 50 years of discrimination is used in shaping the decisions that this automated system is going to make in the future under the guise of neutrality. And some research by some colleagues last year brought this to light, where they actually studied one of these algorithms and showed that it was allocating care to white patients much more than Black patients who needed it desperately. And so the issues we're talking about today really have life and death consequences.
Absolutely. Beyond being delayed at the airport because your hair is suspicious, according to TSA wave machine things.
Yes.
I particularly appreciate how you've taken this from something that's seemingly innocuous to something that is intensely, vitally important and potentially matters of life or death. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, and your research has provoked this, it isn't that we are taking decision-making entirely out of human hands, because human hands are creating these devices and technologies. So I wanted to turn you to talking about who that is. There's a lot of dialogue about increasing diversity in the technology sector. One could imagine that with more diversity, someone would have caught why the soap dispenser doesn't work or who it doesn't work for. And so there is a lot of energy around diversity in technology. We have some colleagues on this call today, or this meeting today, who are doing really important work in trying to advance that. But also this meets resistance. I'm thinking of the 2017 letter that circulated around Google, really disrupting the diversity dialogue, which isn't unproblematic, but also clearly discriminatory in and of itself, with lots of stereotypes and assumptions that weren't contested, that weren't challenged, and in fact generated a lot of support internally in the organization. So I guess I want to talk about the trouble with tech bro culture and taking this into the humanities to really explore how to unpack that and maybe how to shift it.
Yeah, and I think, and I like the framing of tech bro culture, because it really is about not just these spectacular instances when the shit hits the fan, but really the everyday norms and practices that people take for granted, the cultural milieu of an organization or an industry. And one of the things I would have us think about, especially to the extent that there are a number of academics and people in academia on the call, is that tech bro culture is also academic culture. And the fact that it's so vital that we talk about tech bro culture is because they have an outsized influence on everyone's lives in their designs and in their products. But the same kinds of forms of racism and sexism that inform that Google letter are rife in academia. That is, the idea that some groups are naturally inclined towards STEM, or some groups are, their culture supports education and therefore they thrive. And some cultures are, anti-education or or not invested in education. And you, even as I say this, I'm not naming the groups, but the fact that we all know who I'm talking about means that it's a cultural phenomenon. The fact that it permeates our thinking, it is part of the water and the air that we breathe in this country, that we think that intelligence, we have a very racial, ethnic sort of notion of who is more intelligent, who is more athletic, naturally speaking, in terms of genetics, and who's more intelligent in terms of math and science, who should take leadership positions, who should take orders. And so all of these things, tech bro culture is part of American culture in terms of these ideas that, when it comes to gender and science, or when it comes to race and mathematics. And so I think as much as we do want to critique and call and expose how it infects our tech industry, and then how we all have to deal with the consequences of that, namely the fact that, for example, most of our social media platforms don't take racist and sexist harassment seriously, is a direct byproduct of who's behind the screen. The fact that the people designing and creating these platforms, they themselves do not have to face the brunt of these kinds of things, means that when they sit around to design a platform, they think, oh, we need free speech. We don't care about if people are harassing or making death threats or rape threats. And so there's a direct relation between who's behind the screen and what we have to engage. And at the same time, I really think we have to also look in our own backyard in terms of the way that, a professor at my own university, Princeton, in the last 2 weeks, you can look up a public letter that he wrote, basically saying that all of this race talk is, it's crap, because we know that these groups are going to, or are naturally, deserving to have these spots in the university, and these other groups are going to take their spots, right? And all of it, if you read between the lines, really draws on this long history of scientific racism that tries to naturalize hierarchies and looks to science, looks to biology and genetics as a legitimation for what are at base really harmful and oppressive ideas about who has what qualities and who has what capacities. And so, yes, to tech bro culture, and yes, to us sort of diversifying, but there is also a whole conversation that we can have about how diversity is not going to save us. That even if you have a very diverse team that's creating something, if that diverse team is valuing profit maximization over other values, then you can have all the Black and Latinx and Indigenous programmers and designers and everything in the room, their own thinking about, we have to cater to our shareholders, we have to maximize the profit. They're also going to make many of the same decisions that we see in the more homogenous tech workforce. And so we need to think diversity, and what else do we need to be working on?
Wow, thank you. That's incredibly important. It isn't diversity the end all, but thinking about justice and equity, which your work also engages. From this culture of technology, I want to take the conversation to looking at public participation and private actors, and the amount of power that private actors have in shaping our public discourse. So you said we could talk about diversity. As it turns out, under a recent executive order, it is not entirely clear that our diversity conversations wouldn't come with consequences for those of us who receive federal funds. So there is a very deliberate effort to change the conversation, shut down the conversation, or silence it, and characterize conversations in ways that will make it more difficult to have what already is a difficult topic to broach. So I wanted to put that in play, and also press you to think about the public square, now dominated in many ways by private social media platforms. As we are entering into an election, democratic deliberation depends on access to information, and yet a lot of the content moderation, to the extent it exists, is largely in the unregulated hands of private commercial actors who are coming from a culture that involves exclusion or inequity. Don't know that I have a question in that other than to invite you to comment and perhaps take us to where we might imagine something else.
Absolutely. And so, you know, one of the ideas presented in the intro has to do, the intro of Race After Technology has to do with thinking about where and how does public policy get shaped, you know? And so to the extent that the big six, that is these major, you know, tech companies monopolize resources and decisions, and that their decisions have such wide sweeping public policy consequences, you know, for example, you know, we think about the fact that we have laws that outlaw housing discrimination, you know, and yet if I'm a housing developer, I can go on one of these platforms and create a targeted advertisement. And until recently, I could exclude certain racial ethnic groups from seeing that advertisement. So it's a kind of digital redlining that says, I don't want these groups to have access to this opportunity. And because it's happening behind the screen and the decisions of the company to allow it are essentially facilitating ongoing forms of housing discrimination. The same goes with employment discrimination. There are instances in which some companies have opted for women not to see their employment ads, or the elderly to see these other services. And so based on the opportunities to exclude and include certain groups, it in many ways intersects with things that we thought were settled in terms of legal precedent and law when it comes to discrimination, but it continues to be facilitated through these platforms. And so this tells us that we can't leave it to these companies to regulate themselves, because there's money to be made in being able to do this kind of tailoring. And that's going to trump other kinds of public values that are anti-discriminatory kind of values or anti-racist values. And so we need third-party independent oversight. We need to rethink the larger ecosystem in which protections are made for all of us using these tools. And one example that I just posted in the chat is the Real Facebook Oversight Board, which of course is not a Facebook board. It's a group of scholars and policy folk and ex-Facebook employees and journalists who we've organized ourselves into a board that we think should already exist. And we're operating as if we are the Real Facebook Oversight Board. And what's so interesting is, although Facebook has its internal ethics board, which hasn't done much since it was formed, since in the last 2 weeks, since this real board has formed and we've made it very public in terms of our criticism and our calls to action, many of the things that Facebook has been sitting on, especially around the election, they've quickly moved to try to pass certain kinds of changes to what's possible in terms of targeted advertisement and so on around political ads that people have been calling for since 2016, at least, since Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on. And so this is an example of, in some ways, a creative exercise that's at once serious about the need for these kind of independent oversight that's not beholden, it's not internal to the company. And so I would encourage everyone to check out the link I just posted and to follow what's happening with the Real Facebook Oversight Board as, you know, one sort of example or alternative sort of model for how we might go forward in terms of public interest technology and demanding what we want from these companies rather than waiting for them to act in our best interests.
Thank you very much. I do commend everyone to look at the Real Facebook Oversight Board. As you talked about that reminded me of a real world example where targeted advertising could have had tragic consequences in the space of Facebook. Just recently, a state governor was subjected to a kidnapping attempt because militias and alt-right-wing groups were able to shape and find one another. Arguably, some experts and researchers are suggesting because of the way the targeted advertising works. Could you explain that for us?
That's interesting. It's not really my specialty,
Oh,
so I don't know if I can connect those dots. For me, it goes back to the affordances of a particular platform, what it facilitates, what it allows by the way that it's designed, and what it prevents in terms of harms based on the decisions of, you know, what the algorithms privilege over other things. And so I actually wasn't aware about the connection between the targeted ads and the Facebook groups. Although I imagine, if, you know, without having done the homework,
right.
I would imagine that if I was an average Facebook user who had been posting messages or clicking links that had a white nationalist spin on it, then the algorithm would find me and present me with the opportunity to join a Facebook groups that also shared that ideology, which would enroll me in a more organized fashion into that kind of ecosystem, and then perhaps fuel my hate or my antagonism and mobilize me. Whereas before the ad, I might have just used social media to let off steam, racist steam. In this case, it actually arms me and emboldens me, because I'm now with a larger group that's willing to act on those ideas. We know that was behind, for example, the Charleston shooting a few years ago, in which the social media, the behavior of the shooter showed that he was slowly drawn into this milieu and further indoctrinated based on his initial inclinations. And it's hard to know definitively whether without that indoctrination and emboldening, he would have ended up going into that church. And so I think that there's a definite complicity in these companies in turning a blind eye or using the rhetoric of free speech in order not to take these issues seriously.
Yeah, and hopefully that is a conversation that can be changed, but you're spot on. And that's what some researchers are suggesting happens. Once you like this, you'll also like that. And then you're down a rabbit hole of potentially racist conduct.
And one thing I'll say is that just last year, perhaps it was, YouTube changed its own recommendation algorithm in order to stop those types of things from happening. And so, you know, who knows, with a click of a button, they actually created a policy that said that they would not recommend more and more racist videos if someone had shown an interest in it. And so it's within their means. It's not rocket science. And so I think there's a different model for those who can fact check what I'm saying. Perhaps you can pull up a link that shows what YouTube's policy is with respect to recommending racist and white nationalist content, because I have a vague memory of them changing their policy at some point.
Yeah, and I like to tell my law students, these are not the laws of gravity, right? We can change some of these laws and policies.
Good. Yeah.
So it's now the part of the program where I'm going to turn to our postdoctoral guest, Yamna El Said, to engage the chat. Yamna is with us from, most recently, the University of Southern California's Communications Department. She has a specialization in cultural studies. She has a spectacular project on civic imagination, and she is the Fellowship Award winner that is with us from the American Council of Learned Society. So I will turn over to Yamna to continue our conversation and give voice to some of the questions that have come in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin and Dr. George, for the enlightening conversation. It certainly leaves a lot of us thinking about, with a lot to consider as we approach our research, the technologies that we develop, and as users ourselves. So without further ado, we have 20 minutes for Q&A, and we received several questions through the event registration and the Q&A feature of the webinar. So we may not be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to do my best to synthesize them and bring them all as discussion points to Ruha and Erika. So our first question speaks to what we can do. And it's from faculty member Paula Smith. And she's asking, would you have any suggestions for policies or practices that the IT field can implement, which would help address the issues that you've raised?
Thank you for that question. And I think that this is a kind of an ongoing issue that different programs have to really answer for themselves in light of the scholarship and the advocacy that's been happening over the last several years. And so I'm not going to offer any hard and fast prescriptions, but actually point to some more resources that programs and your fields can use in moving forward. So one of the first things that comes to mind is the work of my colleague, Sasha Costanza-Schock, whose book Design Justice was just published earlier this year. So I would encourage you to check out Design Justice and the Design Justice principles on the website associated with this book as a touchstone, as a guide in deciding how to operationalize those ideas, whether in the context of curricula or in terms of research or other kinds of initiatives. And so Design Justice, the framework and the principles and the practical ways in which they've already been implemented, I think offer a great model for IT. Similarly, the book Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein is a really powerful framework and text that offer lots of great case studies of how we can design and how we can do our work differently. One of the things, and I'm teaching both of these books, so they're on the top of my mind this semester. They're very accessibly written. And even as someone who's been engaging these issues for quite some time, so many of the examples of how different groups and institutions are working on different models of tech development were new to me. Like I didn't know about them. And so they'll really spark your imagination and give you a lot of great ideas about how to move forward when you see how other groups have been doing that. So Data Feminism and Design Justice. The last book I'll suggest is a more irreverent manifesto directed specifically to designers by Michael Montoya. And he's someone who's been working in Silicon Valley for over 20 years. And so he's angry. And you can tell he's angry in his writing. But the anger is fuel. It's fuel for really his incitement for individuals to do better, to actually mobilize and to stand up for the values, public values, not just care about who's paying your paycheck, but really think about yourself beyond a job description. What responsibility do you have? And he likens the lack of ethical framework in the context of computer science and programming and design to the way that ethics has been operationalized in medicine, and says, why don't we have a do no harm commitment to do no harm? And so again, I think these three books are a good starting point for anyone who's thinking about, the way forward. And I think you'll get a lot of great ideas and energy from engaging these, either in the context of a book club or a class or some other kind of collective that wants to move forward on these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin. These are great resources. And if I may take this opportunity to point out that our colleague Scott is sharing a lot of the resources Ruha is talking about and several initiatives that might be helpful if you want to get started yourself on that. So we now move to a very timely question that is related more to pedagogy. And I know how much you stress on pedagogy as a means for resistance, Dr. Benjamin, but now even teaching people about critical race theory has become somewhat under attack. So from Anonymous, we got a question. Could you talk about how we might address critical race theory in our classrooms and research, considering Trump's recent executive order?
Mm-hmm. I can talk about the first part. I really don't know what that order, what that's going to do on the ground. I just saw a headline from my own professional association, the American Sociological Association, who's written a public statement in response to that context, which I can dig up and post. And also I just saw a webinar for scholars and teachers who are concerned about it. My own thinking right now is I'm just going to do what I've always done. And if I get into trouble, I'll deal with it. Like every day there's some new ridiculous shift in policy that's meant to make life harder and more dangerous for all kinds of people, not just scholars and teachers of critical race theory. And so for me, I'm just going to keep teaching, speaking. If people don't want to invite me because it's going to take away their funding, that's okay. But I don't really have a strong strategy going forward in light of this ridiculous order. And so, you know, we need to keep doing what we've always, I think there's so much to do in terms of really integrating, let's just call it sociology and history. We don't even have to call it critical race theory. Let's just call it, we need to integrate we need to integrate the social sciences and humanities in our STEM training, right? So that people are not assumed to be well trained in these fields unless they have some modicum of understanding of even just the history of data. Like, we don't even have to do history in general. I mean, the history of your field, the history of the information sciences, or the history of mathematics. Like, it can be very tailored to the discipline, but I think I'm always surprised when people don't know, for example, about the relationship between IBM and the Holocaust, which was a New York Times bestseller. And yet in our training of, you know, data scientists, somehow we managed to avoid this huge collaboration between a company that still exists and one of the worst atrocities, you know, humankind has managed to, you know, administer. And so, like, that's just one data point where I think we can do so much better. And we don't need to call that's not critical race theory. That's just history. That's like New York Times best-selling history. Let's just add some of that, in part to just grow our awareness and our insight into the potential dangers and power of seemingly neutral tools and fields. And I think that alone can make our students, make ourselves and our field just more reflexive about what we're doing, and not assume that just because we want to do good in the world, that what we produce will necessarily have that effect. And so we need to engender more technological humility in terms of what we're actually doing, so that we don't assume that our intentions are the end all be all in terms of what happens. And so that's kind of my riff on this Trump policy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, for that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, since we're speaking about the relationship between citizens and the state, I was wondering if you can shed some light as to how technologies can be used to police those citizens. We have student Kelly DeLone is asking, how can technology uphold the carceral system and expand the prison industrial complex? If you can talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a few concrete examples I'll point to as part of a larger phenomenon that I call carceral technoscience. And that's more of the focus of my edited volume, Captivating Technology. But partly is to understand how, many times these tools that we find continue to contain and surveil people, how the promise of them often is that they're more humanistic than their counterparts. So let's start with this idea. Prisons, as they were initially imagined and enacted, were reforms. They were progressive reforms that meant to move us away from capital punishment and hangings and beheadings, right? So prisons were a reform. Now we understand how deeply violent and unjust some of us understand how deeply violent and unjust our prison industrial complex is, for a variety of reasons. And so now we've painted prisons and jails as the problem. So the question is, what are the reforms for prisons and jails? And in many ways, carceral tools like electronic monitoring or apps that keep tabs on you when you're not being held in a cell, these technologies are being framed as the reform to prisons and jails, which we now cast as deeply, dehumanizing. But these new tools, like prisons before them, actually create a new context that's even more punitive and has even more detrimental effect on people's lives and opportunities. And So rather than continue to innovate new ways to punish people, maybe we should take stock of why we're so attached to the punishment apparatus and punishment as a logic of social life to begin with. And so stepping back from constantly trying to tinker with new tools and ask ourselves, what is this larger context in which we feel such a strong desire, not just to punish everyone, but typically to punish particular groups based on class and race and nationality and so on. And so really the solutionism of technology, we need to sort of wake up to the fact that the solutions often produce new problems. And I write a little bit about that in both of the books mentioned earlier, but there's many other scholars who write in the context of abolition, prison abolition, that are focused not just on putting an end to cages, prisons and jails, but also other kinds of tools that continue to contain people. And so electronic monitoring, other digital surveillance tools, and so on. And so hopefully that just sketches out a little bit of the response to that question, but it's really important. And for those younger scholars on the call, there's so much work that can be done and needs to be done on this, whether we're talking about in the context of ICE and ICE's collaboration with different tech companies like Palantir in order to find new and fancier ways to keep track of immigrants, or other forms of carceral technoscience. We need your thoughts and your research on these topics.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. Certainly eye-opening. I mean, the fact that we need to change our lens and the way that we view the concept of punishment in itself. So we have time for one or two more questions. We have one question coming from the audience, and it says, since we're talking about tools, how they can control us, are there tools you know of that can help advertising teams? So it's the other way around, that can help advertising teams avoid cultural appropriation in advertising campaigns. Didi Olson here is mentioning that best intentions and lack of education is a challenge to overcome when you don't know where to look, or you are served content that reinforces your bias.
Can you say the last part of that again? I heard the part about tools for advertising. What's the other part?
So the other part is that Didi is mentioning here, best intentions and the lack of education can be a challenge to overcome when you do not know where to look, or you're served content that reinforces your bias. So if you are in a position of power, or in a position where you can influence, what do you do to educate yourself? I think that's what Didi is trying to get at.
Yeah, thanks, Didi. You can definitely start with the texts that I already mentioned. Although I was referring them in the context of IT, they really apply to anyone that has anything to do with STEM in general, with a technological development in particular. And you can definitely apply the insights in all of this work to the context of advertising and marketing. That's not my specialty. I will just point out, part of the tension is that there is a demand for targeted advertising. That means we enjoy being seen by technology, where the ads seem to understand our tastes and our interests. And so the issue is not just a top-down change of how the platforms and how the recommendation systems need to be designed differently, but also a kind of cultural reckoning with the conveniences and the representation that individuals and groups enjoy in their relationship with these tools. And so I will just put that out there to say that in moving forward, in the same way that the passage of some laws does not magically sort of dissolve discriminatory practices, changes at the level of companies or institutions in terms of the design of platforms isn't magically, like, if we don't have recommendations for racist Facebook groups, that doesn't mean that the racist groups disappear, and so there's a entanglement in terms of the affordances of the technology and the cultural phenomenon more broadly that I think there's a room for us to wrestle with and think about our individual complicity in maintaining the desire for many of these things that we're calling out as harmful. And so I'll just put that out there as a kind of non-answer for us to think about.
Oh, I think that was an answer. Unfortunately, that was our last question, but I think what we take from that is there is the space that we do have the imagination that we can create and identify opportunities. There's such a rich conversation going on in the chat that I was following. I do want to let the audience know that you can continue this conversation. This is a series for us. We're going all year. So if you follow us on our social media platforms, you'll find out more. And we will make a space on our website to list some of the resources that Professor Benjamin has shared with us, since there has been such tremendous interest. We are so grateful, Professor Benjamin, for your presence here. We are grateful to our sponsors who made this possible, the O.C. Tanner Foundation that took the leap and gave us seed funding to carry forward. They're longtime contributors and believe in lifelong learning. And we have much to learn about this subject matter. So thank you for literally giving us a syllabus today.
Awesome, my pleasure. Thank you for hosting. Thanks everyone for dialing in.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruha.
Thank you.